Well, good day, everybody. It's time for us to have a chance to break out the Bible and turn to the text of James in chapter 2. And we've got another segment of study to hopefully enrich our hearts and to grow in our understanding of what James is instructing the dispersed Christians in the first century, and certainly of practical value to us in our century. Terry, how are you doing today? And we've got Steve with us, so we'll talk to him in just a second.
I'm doing great, but I don't know. I've lost count of the days. I don't know about you. It's hard to remember what day it is with my kids not going to school. So I woke up this morning wondering if it was Monday or Wednesday, or I didn't know what it was. So
Yeah,
I
it's
think it's Tuesday.
yeah.
I think it's Tuesday is where we're at. That's about the best I can get to.
Well, I'm drinking my official taco beverage, so that should give you a hint that I checked the calendar. Steve, how you doing?
We're good up here in Chicagoland. Still in, they don't like the term lockdown, but shelter in place, stay at home since last week. And of course, before that, the 10 rule and then so forth. So like everybody, we or maybe not everybody, but we had services remotely, I guess you'd say. I did a sermon actually from the building to kind of keep things normalized as much as possible, but it was streamed live on our Facebook and then we put it on our YouTube channel. So we're trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Betty and I are staying in. She has underlying conditions of asthma and reactive airway things, so we're trying to keep her safe.
That's
I'm doing
good.
okay, thanks.
That's good to know. Good to hear too, because a lot of folks, both in my area and in Terry's area, love your family greatly, and it's good to know that you're making the choices for your safety that are best for your family.
Thank you.
Um, So we're going to be digging, like I mentioned earlier, back into James chapter 2 in a moment. Terry, if you would read verses 20 through the end of the chapter, just kind of bring us up to speed on the text for today. And we'll do that to at least start. Then we'll back up and begin to just work our way methodically through the textual chunks. Not so much verse by verse, but more about idea by idea. Um, Terry, why don't we go ahead and do that? We can go ahead and start reading through chapter 2, verses 20 to the end of the chapter.
All right, verse 20. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead.
So, as we kind of talked about already, this is like looking back, a little quick review. The text of James has intertextual connections, tie ins, allusions, shadows, whatever you want to use as the various explanatory terms to the Sermon on the Mount and the broader teaching of Jesus, both in style and in content. I think a way that I look at it is James is the expanded notes version of the Sermon on the Mount. And so there's a lot of that we can talk about. But let's hone in right now back into our immediate context, chapter 2, closer context, even back to verse 17 of chapter 2, and what actually James is getting at the center of these two notable individuals. Abraham and Rahab are really identifiable souls in the lineage of Christ, in the lineage of Israel, in the lineage of God's people in a couple of different ways. And so, what's going on here? Steve, you're here, you're new with us today, so you get to start. All the hot potatoes go to your table. So, what do you first see there?
Well, I would actually go back even a little further. James asked a question back in verse 14.
Mm-hmm.
What good is it, my brothers, if a man says he has faith but has no works? Can faith save him? The remainder of the chapter is really working out the answer to that question. And the idea is, of course, faith alone, as Terry read, faith apart or divorced from works? And the answer is no. And as you pointed out, tying this to the Sermon on the Mount, I mean, one would think of texts like Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So Jesus himself is tying not only the intellectual side of faith, the verbal side of affirmation, both of which are extremely important, of course, but it has to be worked out, if you will. It can't be a dead faith, to go to another text here, but it's got to be something that is expressive in works. And Abraham, well, Rahab as well, but Abraham, who's cited here with a text from Genesis 15, that's also quoted in, among other, Romans chapter 4, which may be a text that we want to revisit here in a few moments if we get that far. So all of this is, I think, has to be integrated, as you say, into the teaching of the Lord, but the teaching of Paul. These are not contradictory texts, as some would affirm, but they highlight different aspects of a process that everyone has to be that has to be active in everyone's life. So I don't know if that addresses your hot potato or not, but I'll throw that out as a start, and you can veto it and move on if you want to.
Oh yeah,
Yep, that's good.
yeah. There's a lot
think,
there. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we pointed out yesterday was this kind of differentiation in verses 18 here through 19 of faith versus belief, which kind of touches what Steve talked about. But we always, at least I grew up, you ask me what faith is, belief is the go-to definition for faith. But there seems to be an intended kind of, and I think it's just a play on words, that faith is action and works along with belief. But what some people call that faith is just belief, and even the demons believe. So there's this intended contrast between this intellectual kind of verbal, as Steve described it, belief or verbal intellectual faith versus real faith or true faith that actually is seen in that it produces action and obedience and submission.
Yeah. I like Paul's bookends, if you will, or inclusio in Romans. Well, I mean, Romans 4 is the other text another text that uses the Genesis 15:6 quotation that's used here in James. And, he talks about the obedience of faith, both in Romans 1 and verse 5 and Romans 16:25, at the beginning and the end of this great epistle, which uses the same text here. He talks about faith tied to obedience. I mean, that idea is not something that's peculiar to James. It's systemic throughout New Testament teaching. So I think that's an excellent point to make, Terry.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that there. It's interesting, and this is one of the questions that comes up from time to time about this text, the inclusion of these two different Old Testament, we'll say worthies or persons or whatever you want to use. Any descriptor is fine because they are in some ways compromised. You look at their life and their background. In other ways, they are at very significant transformative points in the history of God's seeding work through the Old Testament, whether it's the seed that is the people of Israel or the seed that is the people that make the lineage of Christ. And Rahab's inclusion here, and this is something that I think we want to talk about a little bit. She's always included by her profession in a lot of New Testament texts. The profession we find her, and I like to think of it this way, as a pre-convert or a new convert, because Rahab is a conversion story in the Old Testament. But the New Testament writers, who are very familiar with that about her, they refer to her present tense as Rahab the prostitute. Now, it's present tense in the context of when this event takes place. But Abraham is not Abram, he's Abraham. He's later in the process here when we see him in this sense, what he's referred to. Is there some value into digging in and unwrapping those Old Testament circumstances and settings as we see them in James' usage here? Terry, do you want to start with that? I've got some thoughts. I'm sure Steve might. We'll kind of work our way around the horn to break that out.
Well, I mean, if you ask if there's value, I think there's absolutely got to be value, or they wouldn't be included. I think that's for the simple answer. I think one of the things to point out about this that I'm always struck with, to start with Abraham, since he just is chronologically first. One of the things that I'm always impressed with Abraham is that when Abraham's asked to do this with his son, it is at the time where he has been able to mold and shape and grow in his faith that he would respond in this way. And I think that's one of the interesting things just to think about that. I don't think Abraham several years earlier had that kind of faith based on his actions, right? I think we all would agree with that what we see with Abraham is, if we look at it closely, and I think that's one of the encouraging things here when we think about this kind of faith, is Abraham wavers in his faith quite a bit throughout his story. But we come to this story, and this is kind of the pinnacle, if you will, of Abraham's life, and it's used as this ultimate example. So I think one of the things that has to be understood in this is that there's a maturation process in your faith to get to this point. That's probably not what you're looking at, but it's one of the things I want to encourage people who read this kind of story and think about Abraham in this way and think, well, I could never do that. That may be true today, but that doesn't mean down the road you won't have that kind of faith. That is something that is developed. And I think all of us see that our faith is stronger today than it was, years ago. And that also is a theme in Scripture. I think it's not just that faith includes obedience, but that your faith matures in order to assist you and help you as you grow into being more obedient. I think that's encouraging to think of. And so I'll just throw that out there as kind of a side piece and let y'all dig a little deeper into the rest.
Steve?
I guess I see Abraham living a life of faith. I mean, it's certainly true that the 15th chapter is a significant point. I mean, he's kind of complaining to God about these promises, and yet he has no seed. There is no lineage. When we speak about the lineage, but there isn't any. Eliezer of Damascus, a slave born in my house, is going to be my heir because I have no son. But it's also true that, I mean, even from the beginning, Hebrews talks about Abram's faith as he got up and left his family and went to a place that he didn't know where he was going. I don't know if I'd ever do that. I mean, to be quite honest, truthfully, I don't know of many people who would actually do that. There are a lot of people who pride themselves on never leaving their hometown or their home state or never leaving their country. And to think about doing that and coming into an entirely foreign situation is daunting to most people. And so Abraham lives this life of faith. And so I think Terry's correct. There are high points, and this is certainly one of them, because God is about to reveal when he says in Genesis 15:6, Abram, he believed God and he reckoned it to him. He accounted it as righteousness, which is this point that Paul picks up on, particularly in Romans chapter 4, although it plays out also in Galatians and here in James in a different, somewhat different kind of way as well. So I'm not disagreeing with you, Terry. I would just kind of like to contextualize Abram's entire life of faith, even in the building of the altars that are described over the course of his lifetime, the fact that even after he gets his son, he's willing to go and sacrifice him. I mean, all of these are significant acts of faith that, despite many of us pointing out Abram's shortcomings and lying in Genesis 12 and 20 and the other points at which his faith failed, man, he also has a faith that would dwarf, I think, most of what I even see in my own life and see in the lives of others as well. So I'll just throw that on the table and leave it there. Philip, your turn.
So there's a couple things I see. You think in the text of the Gospels, how often there's an interaction between Jesus and the religious leaders of the day, and Abraham is the tipping point. We have Abraham as a father. We have Abraham as a father, and so I think James is basically doing a 1-2 punch combo where he jabs with Abraham to an audience that's already familiar with being smacked down with Abraham, and then his cross is Rahab. And so he's kind of punching them spiritually speaking, um, with two challenging figures, that at different points they have to make huge spiritual choices because their entire landscape changed. One of the questions that comes up about Rahab a lot is the very specific thing that James brings up is something that creates spiritual tension for someone who is seeking an honest life. Um, and that's a challenge to figure out because there's no getting around this textual reality. In the story of Rahab, she deceived the governing authorities to protect the Israelite spies. But why did she do so, and what did God do with that, and how did he respond to her? That's the gut punch for these disciples who are about to be pushed out by their governing authorities and need to trust God. We've got a question we'll bring in a second that's slightly off topic, but I don't think it's super significantly off the reservation. Actually, it's pretty close. But comments and response to our triple threat answer there? You guys have extra stuff you want to drop in there?
Well, I'm just going to say, in kind of wrapping up what Steve and I were talking about, I think one of the great things is that even though these heroes have tremendous faith, we see that they're real people. That to me is the most encouraging thing about all of that is those moments. I got to be honest. There's a part of me that is grateful for the record that shows that Abraham was not perfect in those low moments of life. That encourages me and helps me to know that that even these people that we look up to as these tremendous heroes, they were actually not perfect, and that's an equal encouragement to us. And I think that's a good thing, to see those peaks and valleys and to notice those kind of things.
I think that's a critically important point to make. I was just about to say peaks and valleys. I mean, because it tracks with our own experience that in our lives we have moments where we are called upon and sometimes often do express and act out our faith, even when it's costly to do so. And yet there are other times when we act more like Abraham at his low points or everybody else, so that the old cliche that God uses flawed people because that's the only kind of people he has to work with. Certainly is true in this context.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things is that if you watch me in my life, there are going to be days, quite frankly, that you're not going to see my faith through my works as you should. And I think that's one of the things to keep in mind about that. That's normal. That's normal for us. It's not something that we should be proud of, but that's real life.
Yeah.
And it's true. The same was true of Abraham. And I think that's one of the reasons, by the way, with Rahab, I think even this idea that she's forgiven, but that tag is never removed from her. Yeah. It's the same kind of thing for me. Is these are real people with ups and downs and good and bad, and that's an encouragement. We're the same way.
Yeah. We'll get to our off-topic thing in just one little second. There's one more tidbit to this I think is really important, is that the motivation for the behavior of Abraham and the behavior of Rahab is equivalent. Rahab is moved because she believed. And remember in the Old Testament text with her belief came from reports of the might of Israel, that nations melted before them. That's all we know. Like, is there possibilities that she had longer insight? That's all speculation. But what we know from the text is the power of Israel, which is the power of Jehovah, convicted her to belief that this is absolutely what I need to do. And so you look at Abraham, the power of Jehovah and the trust he had in Elohim and Yeshua and the whole big picture of who God is motivated him to move and to do, even to extreme levels. One other thing that I think is really specific is that both of the actions they engage in are odd. Human sacrifice is textually odd. Deception and deceit is textually odd. I'm not even talking about the morality of it, which God is the one who sets the morals of these occasions, but they are in opposition to the general standing practice of what everyone is comfortable with when we think about what God wants. And so there's some tension there in the text that we have to digest, and that probably is why we get uncomfortable with it.
It's interesting to go back to an earlier point. If you look at another New Testament text about Rahab, which is Hebrews 11, of course, in a context of, by faith, this refrain, by faith, followed by an active verb in every case. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, again, as you say, the tag stays with her, did not perish along with, what's the contrast? Those who were disobedient. And so her faith led her to obey what was required, even if it meant subverting the government and lying to authorities and so forth, which would be, again, a huge step, I think, for people in most cultures to try to take, maybe more so in repressive regimes, but even in our own fairly, conscious of rights and due process, to go against the government in a blatantly subversive way is, man, that's a huge step that I think a lot of people are not willing to do. Certainly not for religious reasons.
So YouTube commenter brought in, I think I know who this is, but I'm not going to connect it just yet with this. Slightly off topic, what significance do you place on the broader contextual emphasis of relationships between the rich and poor? Because that's part of the earlier dialogue. Abraham and Rahab follow that model. I'll make my quick comment and then the two of you guys can jump in. Do not be surprised when the biblical writers have structure and concepts in the literary sense to their writing that matches all of God's earlier work, because God himself is the author of all of this. And so a literary structure like this is no surprise. It's normal. It's normal in the Old Testament. It's normal in the prophets. It's normal across the board. And it's intentional. It's not just random, oh, I'll pick this person. There's definitely a reason. We might not know, but there's a reason. Steve, this time, then Terry?
Well, I certainly agree with the major premise of the comment as I understood it as you're reading it. Certainly there is structure, and we should not ignore, and in fact, probably have in the past too often ignored the literary structure of these works. With regard to the specific issue of rich and poor, I mean, it's quite true. I mean, James is concerned about how those who are wealthy treat the poor. If you look at Abraham's not a poor person. I mean, Abraham has wealth and has accumulated property, at least in terms of flocks and herds, and is able to take 318 of his own men and arm them and tear out after several kings. This is not a poor person we're talking about here, but he is a person who, as far as we know, as far as I can tell, is cognizant of the needs of those who do not have his material wealth. So I'm not arguing with the major premise here. I'm just trying to figure out how, and I mean, even with regard to Rahab, who has control of a house, a public house, if you will, and the old cliche about why did the spies go there is because that's one place in town that strange men coming to town can go, and nobody's going to think very much about it because strange men come there all the time, or unknown men come there all the time. So she's operating some kind of a business. I don't mean to imply that she's wealthy on account of that necessarily, but I'm just trying to figure out how these two characters fit into what the questioner is driving at. I'm not disagreeing with the major premise of it. Terry, you want to straighten me out on this?
I think one of the hesitancies I have is there is, and it's not a bad thing. I think there's a major push right now to really focus in on rich versus poor and social injustice. But I think that's a part of this, but I think it's even greater than that. I think, James 2 is not just talking about rich and poor, although that's the example. It's talking about preferential treatment.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things to think in mind is that there's a lot more at play in this example of preferential treatment than just their wealth. Abraham, the father of the Jews, versus Rahab, a harlot with she's not an Israelite. I mean, she's welcomed in, she's brought in, and she plays an integral part. I mean, we even see her listed in the genealogies and so forth. But there's a contrast there, and I think one of the points of that is that probably needs to be pointed out. And the point in the beginning of the chapter is that the way you view people, if you're like God, is you view them as equals. And here we have a wealthy father of the Jews, well-respected individual, a not as wealthy. You want to debate her wealth or poverty, that's fine. But the point is, she's not Abraham, not as wealthy, not a Jew, not as respectable. But both of them, through their faith, come to God, and they are equal in that sense, in their righteousness. And the point being, whatever you use for preferential treatment and prejudice, put that off to the side. Don't be a respecter of persons, because these two people are examples of tremendous faith from opposite ends of multiple spectrums, not just rich and wealth. And I think that's the important part of this, at least for me, is to see that. And of course, look, this ties a lot back to Jesus, is this idea that, Jesus broke down all those walls of separation and makes us all one. And I think that's the greater part here. And I think we get hung up right now because again, of a big push, which I think is a good thing for us to be more active in good works than maybe we have been. But I think we can get too focused on things like wealth and not see there's a much broader application to this for all of us.
Agree.
Than just how much somebody has.
We should not become judges with evil motives, to go back to verse 4, or to try to say, well, Abraham is this wealthy guy. Whatever the wealth status of a prostitute may have been, she's still a prostitute. Yeah. So she's not a respected member, culturally speaking, in most societies anyway. Yeah. And I think your point is well taken, Terry.
So one of the things I think is a way to think about this, especially in the contrast of the Christians in Jerusalem versus, or as compared to the Christians outside of Jerusalem, through the opening of the kingdom till the present distress for them. And there is a crisscross of relationship where the wealth of that blossoming kingdom in Jerusalem, both physical and spiritual, spreads everywhere. And then as the tables turn and these disciples from Jerusalem are spread elsewhere, many of them would have very likely been poor at this point in physical things, still rich in spiritual things, but now receiving the blessing of those who were once poor, who are now rich, in all of these interrelationships. And as you think about the work of Paul, Peter, Barnabas, particularly the Galatian letter, and their inability to quickly figure out these Gentile brethren are 100% our brethren, and we need to mature beyond that boundary we built. James's letter kind of sits in the middle of that as a "don't you remember what Jesus said" kind of letter. And I think the literary context is there, the application context there is underneath it deeper. Treat brethren like brethren, and live in a relationship with brethren like you actually love and care about one another, is kind of part of the underlying points of it. Stevie, earlier you brought up Romans chapter 4 in relation to the text. Did you want to dig into that before we get any further into the conclusion parts of this?
I don't know how much time you want to allocate to try to unpack Romans chapter 4.
It's just whatever you want to do. With the internet, it's all about our time and people willing to listen.
Yeah, that's right. One thing that has helped me, you guys may, maybe this, is off the wall or doesn't even hit the wall, but where he quotes this, he's again answering the question of what shall we say about Abraham? What shall we say that our forefather in the flesh has obtained? And then the hypothetical is, if Abraham was justified by works, which again plugs directly back to James chapter 2, then he has something to boast about. But in other words, if Abraham was not a flawed person, if he had done everything right, if he had never lied or whatever he's done, then he could come before God and say, here, you told me to do this. I fulfilled the covenant, the contract, whatever you want to call it. But the text quickly disabuses us of that idea by saying that he does not have that standing, that ground before God. So the question here is not just any kind of works. It seems to me that Paul is talking about perfect works, justification by works, which demands, James later will unpack this idea, you've got to keep the whole law. You've got to do everything right down the line. You just can't single it out. And so when we get to verse 4, after he quotes Genesis 15, to the one who works, and a lot of people, it seems to me, read this as to the person who works at all, who does anything or does some things and thinks that's going to justify them because they've been to church a lot, or they've said a lot of prayers, or they've been through religious rituals, or they think God said fly to the moon, and whatever that is, that working, usually defined as something that they think is good to do. That's not what Paul's talking about here. I think in this context, he's talking about perfect works. And the one who works perfectly, who does everything he's supposed to, his wage is not reckoned as a favor, but what is due. I mean, we understand that in employment situations. If you fulfill your contract, you go to your employer, you get your paycheck. That's not grace. That's not unmerited. They're not doing you a favor. You probably think you earned every dime of it.
Yeah.
Probably think you got underpaid if you're like a lot of people. And that helps us understand then the next verse, in verse 5, to the one who does not work. And here again, he does not mean at all, but that would make perfect nonsense out of these verses, whether you work or whether you work. But to the one who does not work perfectly, completely, which is Abraham and me and you and everybody else, including David, who enters the picture in just a few verses. So to the one who does not work perfectly, but believes in him, again, as Paul defines belief or faith as the obedience of faith, not just intellectual faith, his faith is reckoned as righteousness. And an example of that, a primary first example of that, of course, is Abraham. So in a nutshell, that looking at it contextually, I think at least is helpful to me, trying to figure out not only what is Paul saying in this context, but how does it then relate to what James is saying, sort of flying at it from a different angle, if you will. Yeah. So I'll just, that's a 3-minute, 98-cent tour about which we could have a very long conversation. And it's your program. I'll let you go as long as you want to go with that, Phil.
Well, certainly.
Either one.
So 2 things. One, I have no idea how long we'll be doing these daily studies. It depends on how long Terry and I can stand each other, and other factors. But we can certainly add that to the docket of maybe we can do that, because I think a deep dive into Romans on a textual level is a lot of fun. But I'm a big Bible nerd, and so my fun might not be everybody else's fun. Going back to the text itself and connecting that Romans 4 passage for right now, I think there is deep value when we get to the last verse of chapter 2 in seeing all of that. Chapter 2's closing comment, for as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead, is one of the cliche James texts. And I think probably James has more off and improperly quoted texts as an epistle than many of the others. I don't know if that's accurate, but on an anecdotal level, I see it misused as a New Testament text more often than others, especially as kind of like we want a hammer, here's a nail response to either challenging or common questions. So as a concluding thing, what is James trying to teach us here, either about ourselves or God or God's plans for us when he makes such a bold, plain contrast? Either both respond, I ask questions.
I'll go back to what I said in my opening remarks. If you look at all the way back to verse 14, if you look at the question marks in this text, what is James asking? Mm-hmm. What use is it if a man says he has faith and he has no works? Question. Can that faith save him? Question. Or a little bit later, I think, as Terry pointed out. You get verse 21. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac on his son, and so forth? And so the answers to this series of questions is in verse 24. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Or in 26, just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. And I would just suggest that reading this without Reformation tinted glasses, or any other kind of tinted glasses for that matter, these are fairly straightforward questions that seem to have fairly clear answers rooted in texts that take us all the way back to Abraham at the very beginning of the scheme of redemption in terms of promises that were made. So I'll just leave that there for Terry or somebody else to comment on.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Steve's right. The question was, if you go back up here, can someone say he has faith but doesn't have works? And he ends by saying, no, he can't say that. Faith without works is dead. I mean, that's so clear and so plain. And I think I agree with Phil. This has been used as kind of the hammer in so many times. And I think, and I said this yesterday, I'm not against the way we use that, but I do think there is a more pointed application that just has to be made. And that is, James is talking to people we would consider to be disciples. And I think one of the points that's here for us as disciples is, it's one thing to claim discipleship. It's another thing to live it in a way that is apparently seen and is recognized and is active and produces fruit to follow along with other statements that are made. You know, one of the things I think about this text is, if the totality of your faith is showing up for an hour on Sunday morning, and that's basically the only way that your discipleship is seen, I'm not so sure you don't fall into that group of people that thinks that your faith is justified without works. Because if that's the totality of your works, that's not much work, is what I'm saying.
Maybe another way to frame that, I think that's an excellent point, Terry, is I do a series that I call minor characters, and there really is no such thing in either of them. I mean, we're all equal in the eyes of God, but if the Holy Spirit were going to write a one-line comment about Steve Wolfgang, summarize my life in one verse, as often happens when you get these characters that are simply mentioned, what would the Spirit say? What would he say? Would my life rise to the level of, even if in the case of Rahab the prostitute, well, that's mentioned, she's also lionized as a heroine of faith because she her life is summarized in the acts that she did that helped bring Israel into the land that I will show you, as God says. And Abram, even though he has his character flaws, you know, he is our father, if you will, as Paul determined it. So is there an event in my life? Is there a pattern in my life that the Spirit would say, right, here's a person of faith? Or is it like Terry says, I just occasionally showed up?
Yeah.
And the rest of the time I was sort of living a faithless life, if you will.
What is your Mount Moriah moment, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I
exactly.
think that's something to think about. And I'm afraid, and again, I'm not saying don't use this passage in the way so many of us have to talk about this, a doctrine of faith only and how that does, but I think the greater application has to be made here to us. I mean, you need to live in a way that you have a Mount Moriah moment. But I mean, and I've often said in some sermons, what story of your faith are you going to share with your grandkids as just the evidence that you know God was working, that you saw the power of God? I mean, and you think about these heroes, that I think that's what we see is listed as their big moments where, you know, that's a grandkid story kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the great things I've had, and Steve, you had a lot more opportunity than me. I've sat with some of the older warriors of faith, and like Ed Harrell and Harry Pickup Jr. and even, you know, Robert Jackson and Dee Bowman, and I've heard them tell stories of, you know, I think it was Jackson told the story of being chased out of a house with a frying pan and some of those kind of things, you know, because he was teaching the gospel, and you hear those stories that guys share of their work and their faith. And when I go to lectures, I don't know about you, Steve, one of my favorite things they've done last year's is when they focus on one guy's lifetime and he shares the kind of reflection of his life as a preacher.
Yeah.
What are your moments? If you had to do that, what are your moments you would tell somebody? I mean, I wonder about that sometimes. And I think that's something to think about, is don't use this passage so much to fight some false doctrine that you forget the application to yourself in here.
Agreed.
Yeah. One of the things that's, lessons learned from being in a cage is we're cut off from that, well, I went to church today kind of concept, because most of the believers I know across the spectrum of my life haven't been able to assemble with their brethren on the first day of the week for 14, 15 days, for some even longer. Many of the brethren I know who work and worship in China have been dealing with this for 2-3 months or more. I remember early on getting a report from a evangelist there in the area that basically he had an isolation booth that he had to go through to get out of his apartment to go get groceries. He would come back into his apartment and work with a small house church, if you will, in China. And so this is a period of reflection that's presented to us. I think as believers, we have to be wise enough to learn from these lessons while we're in the midst of God reshaping our perceptions, but also live in a healthier way afterwards. And Rahab, her transformation is tremendous. Her conversion to Israel is much the same as the transitions you see of the disciples who follow Jesus. They're not all perfect people, as we define, perfect people. They're typically broken, carrying heavy spiritual loads. Some are loathed by the people who surround them because of their professions: tax gatherers, women of ill repute, soldiers, zealots, Pharisees, Sadducees, people who hate each other, worship together. I remember talking to Joel Plunkett about him preaching during the radical transformation of American culture in the Southeast, and coming home after preaching a gospel meeting and finding all of his stuff on the porch of the house that he was living in, because the brethren there decided that no white man who would preach to black men was going to be welcome in their pulpit. And those are experiences that define your willingness to do the uncommon in the midst of a common foe, which is the devil. He's still doing his thing. I think Keith's comment out of the Matrix, Keith Maddox says, we spend a lot of time thinking about our physical legacy. And I think this text in James forces us to consider our spiritual legacy. That's a spot on observation from the text. We're about 10 minutes past our planned time. We know there's a lot of stuff, people having to work and all those things. I want to say this broadly to everybody. I'm really appreciating your presence digitally, physically, however it may be, in spiritual things. Thank you so much for all your questions and your comments, both on the feed that people can now see, but also privately. Steve, you're welcome to come back through the course of these studies as your schedule allows. Just let us know.
Sure, be glad to. I've enjoyed it very much. I appreciate you providing this platform. I think particularly in a time when we're disconnected from each other. I've only missed less than half a dozen Sunday gatherings before this past Sunday, largely for surgeries or various kinds of separations. And it bugs me. It's unusual. It makes me uncomfortable. I don't like it. And in that kind of time where people would, there are a lot of people who, because of health concerns, understandably, didn't assemble, but would be there if they could. I think that is the determining factor. Is these are not people who are using the present distress as an excuse not to assemble. But all of that to say, I think these times of digital assembly or studying the word via long distance or via Zoom or whatever are increasingly more valuable as we are disconnected from each other in terms of being able to meet. So thank you for providing this platform.
Yeah, my nerd skills came in handy all of a sudden. Terry, last comments. I'll close this off in a second.
Just appreciate Steve joining us and everybody listening. And I like Steve. I think one of my thoughts I've said a lot is that this inability to assemble that we face and how we're trying to face all of those challenges has certainly left me feeling emptier than normal. But it is the digital platform that has allowed me to feel a little more full than I would otherwise. And I'm thankful to be a part of this. Thankful we've kind of ramped that up. And Phyllis Hamilton asked if we're on every day at 10 o'clock. We are right now. We normally, Phyllis, to answer that real quick before I toss it back to Phil, we're normally only on Tuesdays at 10 o'clock Central, 11 o'clock Eastern. And I have to be the one to say that because Phil can never get that right. But
True.
normally it's only on Tuesday, and we're a little bit more probably focused on workings of the church and some of those things, and focused on preacher kind of work a little bit. But we've kind of adjusted that, and we're 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock Eastern every Monday through Friday right now during this time to offer, as Steve said, some spiritual nourishment and hopefully some encouragement while we're all in this difficult time. So we've adjusted that, and so every day, 10 Central, 11 Eastern. Phil?
Okay, so like Terry pointed out, we'll be back tomorrow the same time, 11 o'clock Eastern. I'm not even going to fool with the time zones. People can use the math that I struggle with to figure that part out. So please join us with that. Sunday morning at a time yet to be determined, Jared Saltz and I will be opening up the book of Judges, and we're going to ruin Judges for everybody. And so that's probably our subtitle, or the Warlords of Israel. We can certainly call it that too. But we'll be walking through that text Sunday mornings as we have opportunity. But again, thanks everybody. I'm glad that you're all here. Glad that you could be with us. Take care and God bless.